Okay, I think we'll get going. Welcome everyone to the first EIDA Insight Hour. This is a new series of webinars. They're an hour long, and they're going to focus on specific topics which have been suggested to us by our EIDA members. Currently, we plan to hold them once every couple of months, and they're open to all of our EIDA members, and they're aimed at those who are responsible for and involved in your organisation's response to domestic abuse. But everybody in your organisations are free to join. It's being recorded where we can, and so we'll make the links available afterwards to everybody, and we'll also keep it on the events section of our website. You can see that the chat function's open, so you can use the chat to communicate with us and with each other during the course of the webinar. And if you've got any questions, can you please put them in the Q&A box, which is also open, and we'll try and answer some of your questions towards the end of our session. Thank you to those of you who sent us some questions in advance. We'll try to answer some of those as well. Just before we start, a quick reminder about EIDA and who we are and what we do. So you can see that I'm the CEO, Susan Bright. I've been with EIDA for about 6 months, and before that, I worked with EIDA to help my then organisation, Hogan Lovells, to introduce our domestic abuse policy. So that's how I got to know the organisation. EIDA does 4 things. First, it raises awareness of domestic abuse amongst employers. Secondly, provides employers with the guidance and tools to help them to respond to domestic abuse. Thirdly, supporting employers to share best practice with each other. And lastly, but importantly, collaborating across the sector with government, with the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office and others in order to provide up-to-date guidance and to champion change. Membership of EIDA is free, so do encourage other organisations in your networks, your sector, your supply chain, your customers, please, to join us, because our vision is for all employers across the UK to take effective action on domestic abuse by supporting their people. We've got nearly 1,300 members, collectively employing about a quarter of the workforce across the UK, which is good, but we all know that collectively we need to do more. So it's a massive pleasure, Nicole, to be joined by you, the first Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. And today we are going to focus on the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 and what employers need to know. But first, Nicole, how about a little bit about you and what made you interested in domestic abuse originally and then to take on this role?
Right. Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And like many, I think as the benefit of getting a bit older is I can remember lots of really great milestones in the development of things over the years. And I certainly can remember when the employers initiative started and how exciting that has been. And it's incredible to think about, you know, that number, 1,300 members and a quarter of the workforce. That's amazing. And the work that you're doing, Susan, and the team there is really extraordinary. So thank you. And for anyone on the call and all of the members, you know, thank you for all of what you're doing. It really makes a huge, huge difference. And I'm sure we'll go on to talk about some of the ways that it can in some detail. But yeah, my own background is in domestic abuse services. I mean, you can probably tell a little bit from my accent these days that I'm told I have a strange accent because it's hard to pin down. But I started my career just out of university in the US at a state coalition against domestic violence. So I was the statewide training coordinator, and I did a lot of the work that related to what people in the state needed to do, judges, medical professionals, police, others, and also the standards for the domestic abuse services, all of those types of things. And I came to the UK in the late 1990s, just as an organization called Standing Together Against Domestic Violence was getting organized by its founders. And it was really based on this principle of the coordinated community response, that we really needed to see quite a step change in how agencies and services work together but also making sure that all of that work is really centered around the victim, survivor, really driving that response and from what they need. And so I reflect back, and I came to England in the days where we didn't have EIDA services. There was no such term. And I'm sure, you know, the independent domestic violence advisors, there was very little there was no MARAC, the multi-agency risk assessment conference framework. I mean, there was refuge provision, and there was a little bit of outreach and a little bit of work going on, but certainly nothing like what we have now. So, I mean, I suppose that development over time in the various jobs I've had in the sector at Standing Together, and that early advocacy development really does shape my view. And I was, you know, the way I came to be the DA commissioner was I just simply applied for the role as the Domestic Abuse Act was kind of or the bill at the time was moving towards Parliament. The government decided to create a designate role so that when the when the bill became an act, there would be a domestic abuse commissioner in place. And so this is a very good lesson for anyone out there who's thinking of applying for a role, because we often talk ourselves out of it. And I had several people nudge me to apply, and I had not really done it. And I finally, thankfully did. But I was very, very surprised, as it did take about 9 months, the whole process, but I was surprised at every stage and really delighted to have been appointed. But my big lesson and my big advice that I tell people is always go for the jobs that you're very interested in, and try not to be too held back by what you think you might, you know, that you might not get there, because every once in a while it works out.
That's really interesting. In another context, I'm involved in a charity called 50/50 Parliament, which encourages women to stand and progress in politics. And part of the learning there is you need to ask a woman at least 3 times to stand before she'll even think about it. So I think that advice is really good. There'll be people on the call, maybe, Nicole, who don't know a great deal about the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office and you know what your responsibilities are in that role. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm a public appointee, so I always try to point this out to people, because sometimes people will, if I go to events, they may think I'm part of the government, meaning like it's a ministerial role. So my role is a fixed term, so it won't change if the government changes. Where the office is an arm's length body of government. So in other words, our funding for the office comes through government, but I'm a public appointee. The people who work in my team are civil servants, but they're situated quite nicely in this independent arm's length body of civil servants as a team, because they're really fulfilling that role as a civil servant and trying to work to the kind of strategy and the aims of my position. And the role is very much about public leadership. It's about giving a public voice, not mine specifically, but trying to really bring a whole diverse range of voices to the fore. And we're given in the Domestic Abuse Act kind of that statutory underpinning. So the role was created. Not all commissioners are the same, because of when we have been created and by what means, essentially. So in the Domestic Abuse Act, it creates my role. That means that, you'd have to change the legislation to change the role, which is positive. And we also are given a couple of powers in the office in the legislation. So I'm able, and all of our reports are laid before Parliament. Within the report, I'm able to, any reporting we do, we're able to get information from public bodies. There's a legal responsibility on public bodies to give us information, and we can make recommendations to government that have to be responded to within 56 days. And so that is geared towards allowing our office to really create more of a momentum for change. and a little bit more of a drive forward. We can't get involved with individual cases, although I do hear every day from individual survivors who, on the whole, have tried many, things have gone wrong, and they've tried many options. And we do respond to everyone who gets in touch with us in a really thoughtful way. We don't do kind of set responses, but we really want to learn from those interactions so that we're using that feedback to really drive the kind of wider work of the office. On a day-to-day, I don't know, I always think it's good to describe what we do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the people who work in my office are in policy roles or research roles, or we also have a practice and partnerships team. And it's not a huge office. It's kind of around about 30 people. And the practice and partnerships team is really important because so much of the local practice and commissioning of domestic abuse services and those kind of multi-agency partnerships, that is all happening at the local level, and it can be quite variable from place to place. So we're really, really driven by the idea that we need to stay connected to kind of what's happening on the ground in England and Wales, which is also important. That's the remit of my office, not the whole of the UK. And we're also really keeping up with, across government, all of the opportunities that could relate to domestic abuse. So in one call, I might be talking to the DWP about family hubs or child maintenance. In the next call, I could be talking to the MOJ about family courts and so on. So we're really driving and trying to keep the momentum as people change in government. And what I've really, one of the huge benefits I've noticed is just having that constant of the commissioner's office to kind of keep things, keep the momentum moving forward, even with change and turmoil. Yeah.
So I go to one of your monthly calls, and it's an incredibly useful way to keep up to date and really to feel connected across the sector as well. Can you? Oh, I've lost you. Can you? I can't hear you. Try again. We'll just pause for a moment while Nicole gets her. Can you hear me, Nicole?
That might help. Sorry, can you try again?
Yes, I can hear you. Fantastic. Yes, that's okay. That's
sorry,
brilliant.
I think I just changed a setting. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, don't worry at all. I was just saying I find those monthly calls incredibly useful in terms of keeping up to date, but also keeping connected across the sector. So, I think your ability to convene as an office, I think, is incredibly useful. Moving on to the Domestic Abuse Act itself, maybe to start off with, Nicole, could you share with everybody some of the changes that the Act brought in? And those that are particularly relevant for employers, but bearing in mind employers, it's really important for employers to know what their employees might be facing. It's quite a broad answer, probably.
Yes, well, I mean, the Domestic Abuse Act did a lot of things all at once. And I think one of the most important things, although it sounds really basic, is it gave us our first definition, a statutory definition of domestic abuse. So in the whole of my work, I've always trained to what I described as a cross-governmental agreed definition. So there was not a legal definition of domestic abuse. You might say legally something, a common assault that was domestic abuse, of course there's behaviors that are criminal offenses, but having a legal definition is really important. And I've almost started to appreciate that more as I've been in the role. So it includes the coercion and control. It includes the range of physical, non-physical abuse and coercion and control. And it names children in their own right as victims of domestic abuse, financial abuse. So it's really gives a huge kind of clear framework for our definition, which I've been recently to other countries and realizing that when you operate without that kind of definition, it is much, much harder for entities to agree, oddly, to very sensible things like, for example, what about children? You know, what are our responsibilities for children? The Domestic Abuse Act also created some very specific offenses, things like non-fatal strangulation is a standalone offense, threats of sharing indecent images, very important for all of us to know, and particularly maybe for employers creating or amending our coercion and control offense so that it's applicable post-separation. So knowing that in 2015, coercion and control became an offense, which again is very different from other countries. And again, I've seen other countries really struggle with how to address that range of behaviors. So we're very lucky in a way in this country that we've got that recognized. And in the Act, that was amended so that it would include post-separation abuse as well. The Act does a lot of things that kind of tighten up a bit of the criminal or the justice system. So prohibiting perpetrators from cross-examining in family court, things like that, special measures. It created the ambition of a domestic abuse protection order, which, like any piece of legislation, there's kind of a staggered implementation, and that is just being piloted now. So in the future, employers, you will all have, there will be this kind of Uber order in place that will include positive requirements, things people must do, like getting assessed for mental health or substance misuse or perpetrator programs or behavioral change programs, you know, that you could apply in civil or criminal court. A lot of the orders that we've traditionally have still stand now until that takes effect, but that's being piloted. It created priority need for housing for domestic abuse. So it used to be, prior to the Act, you would have to have additional vulnerabilities like, you know, perhaps mental health, substance misuse, or obviously having children. Now domestic abuse, it is in itself a priority need. That doesn't solve our housing crisis, but it is a line in the sand. The Domestic Abuse Act, very importantly in terms of money, created a duty for accommodation-based services. So when that duty is created, that means the Treasury had to put money aside for areas for their accommodation-based duty. So I tend to think of domestic abuse services as the accommodation, the housing, but also the community-based services. So we don't have funding across the board for all services, but the Domestic Abuse Act definitely helped us move forward in terms of the accommodation-based services. And also, really importantly, probably for employers, and I'm sure you point this out all the time, is there's a statutory guidance in the Domestic Abuse Act that runs alongside, and it has quite a good section, thanks to the Employers Initiative, no doubt, which relates to the role of employers. It gives a lot more context about the role of many, many services. So it's a very good document to remember and know about, because even though those things are not on the face of the bill, they're not in the legislation, the statutory guidance should be abided by. There should be a very good reason, you know, you'd have to have a very high threshold not to abide by statutory guidance. So it's a really important piece of guidance for us as well.
And that's thank you. And that is it's really useful to point to that guidance, because it is a question that comes up quite a lot, Nicole, from employers, which is, well, what are my legal duties as an employer in relation to domestic abuse? I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit. I mean, you know, the guidance obviously says that employers have a common law duty of care to their people who work for them, to their employees and others, and that responding to domestic abuse should be part of that common law duty of care. So I think that's incredibly useful for employers. But, you know, is there more you want to add on that about the expectations on employers to, you know, honestly, to be part of the overall system response to domestic abuse across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that the statutory guidance gives us a really nice basis to
Yeah.
feel confident that that is squarely the role of employers, that employers are very much perceived by most people as a first port of call in terms of colleagues, line management, the duty of care. That I think it's just in standing back from that, just so obvious to us that we have such a connection with the workplace and our employer, and it is really important that that the range of work that is needed to safeguard and to really and think about the well-being of employees really does shift to our understanding of domestic abuse and having that as a really core activity. I think, you know, in thinking about the reflecting of, you know, those early days when I first arrived in the late 1990s, I mean, our perception as a society has changed quite considerably. So I would make the same point of essentially a lot of our systems, housing, health systems, children's social care, you know, all of those systems have required and do require, you know, quite a lot of change to adapt to our current understanding of domestic abuse. We have come a long way from domestic abuse being, you know, a private matter. And we now know, because of our crime survey for England and Wales and so much of the work in this area, you know, I hate to quote statistics too much, but, you know, our prevalence of domestic abuse is extremely high. We should expect most of our employees to know someone or to have experienced themselves domestic abuse, sadly. And so I think, you know, it's really heartening when I see employers really taking this on. And when I'm sure you see this much more than I do all the time, but when you see that happening, what you realize is how much employees appreciate that that there's an understanding about domestic abuse and that there's a recognition. And it, I think, really creates this much stronger feeling of that my employer cares about me as a person, and will understand the complexities of my life. And so I think there's some really strong reasons, aside from the statutory guidance, that I think that should underpin a lot of our thoughts about good practice.
No, I agree completely, and you're absolutely right. Things have changed, and also in terms of, you know, what people expect from employers generally, and also there's the other, you know, the business case piece around this. It always strikes me that if you are suffering domestic abuse at home, how can you possibly come to work? Whatever come to work means, you might be doing that from home too these days, much more, but how can you perform at your best if you're having to deal with that at home? So there's a real you know, need to support employees in that sense as well. And often we find anecdotally that people only start talking about domestic abuse when they're, you know, going through a performance review or something like that. And then there's a risk that the person, you know, leaves employment, and then you've got the economic issues they face as well. So I think, yeah, so we've got a legal expectation, a moral duty, and a business case, it seems to me. But there are employers doing some amazing work. But in your role, Nicole, and generally across the piece, do you come across, can you share any examples of where you've seen really good practice by employers in terms of being part of our overall response to domestic abuse?
Yes, I've had the advantage of, you know, being able to see a lot of this up close. And probably, you know, before being commissioner, I kind of worked my way around. I talked about being at Standing Together. I eventually went back. I worked in other places and went back to Standing Together as their chief executive. And we were very involved in the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, where we did a lot of work with registered social landlords. And I would say this happens in every setting. If you go into a health trust or anywhere else, you kind of you can start to approach an organization like that from the point of view of kind of how they're helping their patients or their service users, tenants. But what you quickly realize is the minute you start doing that, you will, probably the most most obvious thing that will happen at the start is then employees will start to say, wait, this is also happening. You know, I'm subject to domestic abuse, or I want to get involved with this because of this experience. And what I think is so great about the employers initiative is it gives that really excellent framework of support and good practice. So, but definitely what I have seen is, you know, in the best circumstances, kind of knowing that will happen anytime you enter, you know, so having some planning, some very senior buy-in, senior leadership buy-in. I've over the years seen so many instances where we try to go in the front line and to change practice, and if without the senior level buy-in, it can only go so far ever. And so the best examples obviously are when you really have that kind of leadership and shared understanding, but then the real work of having a policy in place, kind of gradually implementing the policy well, and having all of the kinds of things you'd like to see stemming from that, the training, certainly partnerships with experts, domestic abuse services. And, you know, often you see a network of champions, for example, which is always really incredible, because then that starts to kind of create such a lot of connection within the workforce. I always think it's a real challenge for, depending on your level of how large the organization is, how much you can have that engagement with the local domestic abuse service, because if your organization is small, quite local to one area, it can be really excellent and easy to make that connection. And I always say to people, you know, if the domestic abuse service is not knocking down your door, it's only because they will be really busy, and sadly, and they're the pretty lean organizations that are commissioned often, sadly, just to do crisis-oriented work, which they often would love to do a lot more. They would often love to be reaching out to employers, but are very, but maybe won't be doing that as proactively as one might expect, but they will be delighted to hear from you. And so having that local connection, or thinking about, if you're not so local to one area, regional, national, international even, how to create those links with, helplines, experts in the area, just because there's a lot of learning over the years that and just a lot of kind of tips and mutual exchange of knowledge that can happen, that is really, really important.
Yes, and that's where the expertise lies in terms of actually supporting and helping people, because one of the things that is often shared amongst employers is it's not about an employer becoming an expert in domestic abuse responding. It's about learning enough and being able to have good systems and processes, and a culture where people will actually come forward and seek the help, and then being able to signpost out to the expert support that's available. Because sometimes,
and I think it's very true, and I think we can get quite intimidated by the scale of things, and of course it's very, very intimidating to think about someone who's in a crisis, but I also think some of what we have to remind ourselves is that on the whole, the vast majority of employees who are subject to domestic abuse are trying to manage that. They will not expect you to act as the police. What they would really appreciate is that kind of, again, what you've said, the kind of problem solving, thinking through any safety measures at work, the real practical things that employers can do. And there are other touch points and other services that can help with, the harder end or the more crisis end of things. And, but it is really intimidating. So it's only in doing this that we kind of get through and work through those things. So that's why I think what you're doing and your team are doing is so really critically important. And being able to share between employers what they're doing, how they're learning. We have a lot to learn from your network and what you're bringing out for us to help support.
One of the things you mentioned earlier actually was the post-separation abuse, and you know, what you've just said prompted me to think, you know, that is one thing that often comes through from some of our ambassadors who have experience personally of domestic abuse, is that employers can often be absolutely amazing at the point of crisis, but not understand necessarily, indeed why should they, that it's, you know, it could be that this situation goes on for a very long time, or indeed can be triggered at different points further on. So I was talking to somebody who's the person who perpetrated the abuse was sent to prison and later came out, and that point when they came out of prison was another crisis point in a way. So that's something that I think employers are beginning to grapple with. So what are your key priorities at the moment, Nicole? What's burning on your desk? What are you
well, the way we try to prioritize a little bit here is to really think carefully about, as a commissioner, some of my role is to be a critical friend to government, to say, this is what I think you're doing really well, this is what I think you could improve. So we're always trying to calculate, not overstepping what we want government rightly to be doing, or what we can see is happening really well with trust and foundations and other organizations, you know, the sector itself, you know, women's aid, the range of organizations that we look to. And then we'll try to think about our powers that we have, the ability to get that information and to publish reports to Parliament. And that's essentially kind of how we narrow down a little bit of how we prioritize. So right now, we published mapping, for example, last year of services, domestic abuse services in England and Wales. So there's such a lot of variation. And the reason why there's variation is just exactly what we talked about earlier. The services have built up over the years in very different ways, never sitting in core budgets. And so we wanted to bring out where we see huge gaps. So it's called Patchwork of Provision. Anyone can find all of this on our website. And we've made some recommendations to about 23 in this particular report, because so much of our funding has traditionally come from the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice. That all needs to stay, but we also need to see funding from other government departments that will be geared towards different things. Therapeutic support, that's what a lot of victims and survivors told us they need. Support for perpetrators to change, support for children. So the kind of we will always be keeping an eye on that patchwork of provision and what we do to change it. And right now, the most obvious opportunity in front of us for that is the Victim and Prisoners Bill, because it has a provision in it that is about a duty to collaborate for commissioners. So I won't get into huge amounts of detail about that, but it's one of the things that if people are interested in, please, you know, we're circulating quite a lot about amendments to that piece of legislation, because I think that's a really good opportunity in front of us. Another thing that we concentrate on, I'll warn you now, there's 5, but I won't talk in so much depth about every one of them. But the second one is family justice, so the family court. That talk about post-separation abuse. I mean, this is, and employers will see this a lot, is being, you know, victims being absolutely tormented in family court proceedings, prolonged proceedings, accusations of, you know, counter accusations if they dare to bring up domestic abuse. We have, sadly, I hear from many victims who have been advised not to even raise domestic abuse because it all gets too complicated, you know, and that is a really sad state of affairs, very unsafe state of affairs for children. And we're launching a report on Tuesday, which is about family court. And I'd really love it if people would look for it, keep an eye out for it. We'll be laying that to Parliament and having an event on Tuesday. And again, we make a smaller set of recommendations, but very targeted about the things that we feel need to happen to improve family court proceedings. These are the private law proceedings specifically. And we're also launching an oversight mechanism, which is a little bit unusual for a commissioner to do, because one of the things the government has asked us to do is actually to go into family court and have a bit more transparency and look at not individual cases, but look at the practice directions, the special measures, hearing feedback from people going through the court to see if we can be a little bit more targeted about how domestic abuse is being dealt with. Is it being dealt with in a consistent way across court? So we're launching that in 3 court areas in the autumn. We work on migrant survivors. So I was about to say, because so many people are not able to work who are migrants, but not all. I mean, obviously some migrant survivors can work, but these are people who are often left out, or very fearful of systems and fearful of coming forward because they know they often know they have no recourse to public funds. And so we just over the weekend had a response back from government on a report that we launched. It was not the best response because a lot of what we wanted to see happen hasn't been accepted. But that won't stop us. We'll continue with some of that because we've done some work with the London School of Economics and the Oxford Migration Observatory about how we would all benefit as a society from allowing migrant survivors to have not a change in their status, but to allow them recourse to public funds for a period of time. And so we're going to keep at that. And also a firewall so that people wouldn't fear calling the police because they're often fearful that information will be passed along to immigration enforcement. So those are things that we're really focused on. And then we have some work that goes on that relates to domestic homicide reviews and suicide reviews. There'll be learnings in there about employers. And I think Susan, you and I have talked about wanting to do more to bring those findings out. And then also children, we're doing a lot of work right now. We've just finished a series of roundtables all over the country to ask local areas we have children as victims in their own right, what does that mean? What does that really look like on the ground? How is that changing any funding or practice? And we're really, really interested in kind of narrowing down some activity. There's a lot going on about reforms in children's social care. So I feel confident the threat of domestic abuse will be kind of recognized there because it's already in a lot of the findings. But I think there's so much about the community-based service, the children who've been impacted and are victims of domestic abuse and need support, therapeutic support, more ways to kind of settle down, resettle into new communities, all of those kinds of things. And I just don't think we're investing nearly enough on that and what good looks like there. So those are really key priorities. And then we do have a set of criminal justice priorities too, because you see those all over the headlines. Some of those really outrageous kind of mistakes, but also just the fact that we don't have a lot of consistency in our force we have 43 police forces and we need to see a lot more consistency of practice.
Yeah, quite a lot on your plate, I think.
I know, not just a few things to do,
Wouldn't like you to get bored, but no, there's a lot we need to do, and it's really useful, I think, for people to be aware of what your priorities are. Are there any gaps in the laws, Nicole? I mean, I know that the Domestic Abuse Act is only a couple of years old-ish, but if you had a magic wand or you were able to have another Domestic Abuse Act, or indeed other legislation that you could make changes, what would your next priorities be in terms of domestic abuse response in England and Wales?
It really would be, it would be closing those gaps for migrant survivors would be a top priority, just because I feel, and in fact, I'm not even sure that requires legislation. I think that is a decision about who has recourse to public funds that doesn't actually require legal change. But I do just feel we have to always think about, and I always try to be mindful of like who is on the margins. We have all these intersections, of privilege or of challenges. And it does upset me that we know that this is a problem and we choose not to address it as a society, and that people really are then suffering, and often suffering at the hands of British citizens. It's not as if, we do have some like clear responsibilities and moral responsibilities, but I would also say there is something about, not absolutely everything has to come down to funding. I appreciate that. A lot of our changes need to be more systemic changes in the way that we practice or recognize, or, some of the things we've talked about earlier with employers. But there is something that is needed about settling down the kind of core provision at the local level. So what we've seen in the Domestic Abuse Act, which is settling down a bit the accommodation-based services, it really needs to be, what would you expect for a core service for children, for adult survivors as well, perpetrators to have opportunities to change? We don't have a really core set of kind of local provision, and knowing that that's funded, and then it then doesn't allow for our trusts and foundations and all of the other kind of innovation funds then to play their rightful part. And so I feel like that would get us much further faster for all these, the kind of systemic changes that we need. And then I do think we have a lot to do with just our public awareness, our public campaigns. There's a lot that we could build on if we had that really solid foundation, because the last thing we'd want to do is start doing other things and then realize we don't have the services in place, because inevitably, people, the more we would raise awareness, the more people would think that they would come to services or seek a bit of help and support. So there's always so many competing priorities, but I guess those would be the ones I'd probably prioritize the most. And the role of the community, one of the things we know from domestic homicide reviews is that, just like anyone else, most people who are subject to domestic abuse will go to their friends, their family, their social networks. And of course, this is where the overlap with employers is, because a lot of our friends and a lot of our social networks are through work. And so if we know that's the first port of call, but we just don't do enough, which is why I couldn't be any more supportive of what you're doing, is, we have to recognize this is often going to be the first point of disclosure, the first place that someone might think to, and the first place someone will notice something different or maybe different about our behavior or concerning. And so these are our really, huge opportunities that we have to help make a difference.
I obviously completely, I really agree. And having in my, previous role and having brought in a domestic abuse policy and approach, just observing and witnessing and being part of the reaction and people coming forward, you realize what a difference as an employer you can make. Obviously changing lives, but sometimes literally saving lives. And it is so important. Turning it around a bit, what input would be useful, for you, or maybe this is an ongoing question and an ongoing discussion, but obviously we've got a network of employers, we've got people doing amazing work across the piece, struggling with some challenging issues, and I've spotted one or two questions that we had beforehand and also now are about perpetrators in the workplace. And just to tell everybody, that is an area that we're looking at, and we're going to our next networking event is going to focus on addressing perpetrators. We've held a few roundtable discussions with some employers. What are you doing at the moment about perpetrators in your workplace? Because, as you say, every workplace of any size is likely to have victims of domestic abuse, and also likely to have perpetrators who may be in the same business or may not be. So for businesses interested in that, please drop me or one of my colleagues a line. We'll be having more roundtable discussions. Then we're going to have our networking event in September is going to focus on that. And the whole purpose behind this work is to share experience insights, because this is very challenging, and then to create some more guidance that we'll share generally across employers. So for those people who've asked that question, that's a little bit of an answer to that
That is
one.
amazing. And
Yeah.
I would have to say it's when we think about what we could benefit from what you're doing, it is really working through those more challenging issues. And one of the things I would say to members is, some will know this, but I think that our thinking over the years has really changed. At one point, there was a real attitude of there's not enough services for victims. How could we possibly prioritize early intervention or change for perpetrators? I mean, that is long past now. I think people have really recognized we can't resolve any of this unless we do more work proactively with perpetrators. And what I've found really interesting in the last 3 years is just seeing in different parts of the country, it's not everywhere for sure, but there are certain areas where there's some real strategy coming together at the local level for perpetrator work. Starting from people who are quite young, we would all be very uncomfortable calling or labeling a perpetrator. But you would say, well, this is someone who's quite young in a relationship using controlling behaviors, really kind of looking like that's something that they're doing early, and all the way through to kind of the serial high harm, very well-known perpetrators. And so I think we're starting to develop kind of that pathway that recognizes the whole range of work, instead of just saying, do we have a group work program, which of course will only ever reach so many people. So I think there's a lot to bring together from employers, what's happening there, but also looking at kind of the range of community-based work and some of the things that we can learn there. And so it's not easy, and it's going to require bringing together a lot of information, a lot of practice, but it's definitely emerging, and it's a really good time to be doing it. And I can, the police are a good example. I've been to a really great conference recently with organized by Maggie Blythe, who's the National Police Chiefs Council lead. And she was bringing together all of the misconduct kind of teams from forces. So, there's some real emerging practice there to be looking at and talking about. So thank you for pointing that out.
No, and it's interesting. It's a subject that keeps coming up in our discussions with members, and it's interesting, some of the questions. So I'm now going to turn a little bit more to the questions, because we've got quite a few sent in advance, and now in the Q&A box as well. So Nicole, and Nicole, if there are any questions that you don't feel able to answer or want to deal with differently, just tell me.
Okay.
I don't think we can get through them all. There's quite a few, actually. So one here is about, are there any plans to extend legislation to make it a requirement for an employer to have a domestic abuse policy in response? I've not heard of anything.
Yeah, no, I think the short answer to that is not right now. I don't know. That's not to say that would never happen, but because it certainly has been an active debate, I am aware, with the Domestic Abuse Act. And no doubt, as we have elections and changes, that is always up for discussion. So, but I don't know of any current plan now.
Okay. A question here about what more do employers need to do to encourage male employees to come forward and to seek support? Because I think the premise of the question will be that can be harder for men to come forward and seek support than it can be for women, and it isn't easy for women to come forward either. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nicole?
Yeah, I would agree. I struggle. I obviously, feel we represent all victims. So we try to kind of recognize, not be gender neutral as such, because I think in a way being gender neutral doesn't help anyone because what we have to be clear about is the volume of women in particular who come to services and who, you know, there's pretty substantial evidence about. And that is never then to mean that we don't believe that there are male victims. We know, we can see that, you know, services for male victims, you know, receive a lot of outreach from all levels of society, and have all sorts of needs that are some quite similar to female victims, but some can be a bit different. And we have to recognize we have to have all of those types of services in place, and employers would need to recognize that as well. So some of my top tips for that would be thinking about how we represent, you know, the images we use, or however we're communicating to employers or employees, really recognizing all of that kind of nuance and policy and the way that we're talking about things. And, you know, really knowing the real experts out there that relate to male victims. So Respect is funded and, you know, runs a national helpline for male victims. I interact with a group of services for male victims fairly regularly, and that would include Respect, but also organizations like Mankind, and other more local. There's an organization up in Merseyside called the Paul Lavelle Foundation, for example. Sometimes I think one of the things I would really like to do more is be really clear where the real hot spots of activity are. Not to say that there would be hot spots of male victims at all. I think that, like anything, there would be a pretty similar pattern across England and Wales, but certainly the areas that have really proactive work will inevitably be supporting more male victims. So kind of, I would love to help play a part in kind of showing where that's happening. So it helps employers know who's out there and what they're doing. But I really appreciate the question, and it is very important.
Thank you. And there's another question around employers who have both the victim and the perpetrator in their business. So they're working, you know, maybe a big employer, and they find they've got both, and that's particularly complex. Any views you have on how to deal with a situation where you, as an employer, have both the victim and the perpetrator? And I like the point you made earlier about the use of language. Actually, it's something else we're looking at. Use of the word perpetrator is not always great, because often people won't recognize those behaviors, and using that language is possibly not helpful. So I just
I think it is something in our sector, and I do it too. It's that being, over the years, you get very used to using that term because it's so criminal justice oriented. But I agree, within the workplace, there's probably some finessing to do that just to make that, you know, better for, and more not comfortable, and that you don't want to make people who are using violence more comfortable in any sense. But I think you have to recognize even victims often really they do not necessarily think, oh, I like that you're calling my partner, ex-partner, perpetrator. Like, I think we have to be really aware of how that feels, and even when we get quite used to the terms. When I think you have this situation with both employees, both parties as employees, which of course will happen. A lot of times people meet at work. And that's where I think having that really great, excellent feedback about the safety planning, you know, thinking through the options of, you know, safe accommodation, or in terms of safety, not accommodation as such as in terms of housing, but safe arrangements that can be made quite quickly. And also really clear messages and clear communication to both parties. But I think we also, this is where having some expertise building up in your organization, and also links with others, and the kind of work you're doing for advice is really important, because of course we can induce risk, you know, through really wanting to do the best thing. You know, systems and their interventions have to think about how much that, whatever action you take, what that might be doing in terms of posing more problems. So we have to, I think a lot of people think we should go barreling in into these situations, but that, you know, it isn't as quite as easy as that. And so I think having a really a considered approach, and one I would say that I would always fall back on is, you know, a very good trusted relationship with the victim survivor, where you feel that you're able, or someone is able, to have a really clear communication and an understanding, so that you feel you've got a full picture. You're not hearing just part of the picture. And also, you know, a lot of our risk assessments in this area, we tend to talk about these kind of risk assessments and list as they're kind of a bit of a tick boxing exercise. But at the heart of our risk assessment is always the concern of the victim. You know, what is your biggest fear? What do you know, the really consulting and understanding, because they will have been navigating that abuse, and are very good to advise. So so having them at the heart of things is really important too.
I agree, absolutely critical. And in a way, although we're hearing quite a lot now from employers worried about having both parties within their organization, actually I think it's harder from an employer's responsibility perspective, from a legal perspective, employment law perspective, actually, if you've only got the person who's carrying out abusive behaviors in your business, because then you don't have access to the victim. You don't know what's best for them. And, you know, we've heard examples of where, with the best of intents, people have taken action which actually causes greater harm. So you know, it's a very, very difficult area, but very interesting. I'm conscious, Nicole, that we're coming up to time. So I just want to give you 1 minute to say anything else that you'd like to say, any call to action, anything you would like.
Yes, well, thank you.
Wrap up.
I have to say, I'm doing this on my phone, unfortunately, because of IT systems at the home office, but I can see Jasvinder. Every once in a while, this pops up that some Jasvinder, I think from C, has been putting all sorts of links into the chat. I'm sure others are doing it too, and I'll look at that after. But thank you. I can see some really useful information being exchanged in this session, which is great to see. And thank you so much for the opportunity. And I guess my last call to action would be kind of in a very simple way, you know, that I can entice you to try to get involved in the Victims and Prisoners Bill and all sorts of things that are happening in a policy perspective. But I would say, you know, keep taking this on one step at a time. I mean, no one, all those years ago when I came to London and had this very small project, which was run basically by practically just a handful of people, you know, it can be daunting kind of when you think of all these things that you want to do and what society needs to do and institutions. And I would just say, you know, all of our progress has been that kind of one step at a time. Like, let's just try to keep our momentum moving forward with of course some sense of urgency. But I would just say that your involvement with the Employers Initiative is a very smart one, but also everyone will be at different levels in your own organizations in terms of progress. But don't let any of that hold you back. You know, just keep at it and convene the right people, convene the champions and the people who really want to get involved, and you will absolutely make progress. You know, I've never seen people who come together, you know, not make progress in this area, because there's a lot we can do. So I would just say thank you. It makes a huge difference to people. It sends a very important signal to the wider society and to the wider network of employees that this is something that really matters. So I just would say thank you for all that you're doing, and please be in touch anytime with the office here.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for giving us your time, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us, and to the EIDA team in the background for making this happen. Just to give people a heads up, we do have 2 more Insight Hours scheduled for the rest of this year. So the next one is going to be on Tuesday, the 19th of September, and we're going to have Gallup with us, helping us to understand domestic abuse through an LGBT plus lens. And then in November, on the 21st of November, we're going to have a deep dive into the Bright Sky app, because it's got just fantastic information available, which you know, employers can use to share with their employees, really practical. And I mentioned earlier our next in-person networking meeting on the 21st of September from just before 11 o'clock. We'll share details with you, but as I say, that's about addressing perpetrators, and we'd love to see lots of people there. If you've got any ideas for future Insight Hours, please just send them to me or to one of the team. But with that, thank you so much, and I hope to see you all next time. Thank you. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. I'll pick up with you separately. That was great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.